Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. We are doing another spotlight on today, and today we are going to be talking about the author Mira Grant. For those of you that don't know, Mira Grant is actually a pen name for Seanan McGuire, but it is the pen name where she writes biomedical horror. Now, I'm not exactly familiar enough with horror to know if that is a actual subgenre or if it's just one she kind of made up because it fits her best. But as she describes it, biomedical horror is horror that is based on extremely well researched science. And so everything in the books are based on science, and it may not be probable, but it is at least plausible, which in itself is kind of terrifying. it's very well written horror. But to give you an idea of just how well researched this is, her debut series for this particular pen name, the Newsflesh Trilogy, is essentially a zombie apocalypse type story of sorts, but it is all the zombies kind of came about because of these mutated viruses. And essentially, as the story goes, when she was doing the research, she would call the CDC and say, if I took this virus and I did this, and this to it, could I raise the dead? And they laughed and said no. And she said, okay, and hung up the phone. And then she did more research. And then she called the CDC back and said, okay, but if I took this virus and I did this, and this to it, could I raise the dead then? And no. And she said, okay, and hung up the phone. And she kept doing this until the day that she called the CDC and said, if I take this virus and I do this, and this to it, could I raise the dead then? And the answer she got back from the other person was, don't do that. And at that point, as she said, she knew she had a viable virus. So that is how much research goes into this. Also, that is a story that I love because I would hate to be the person at the CDC taking that phone call. It would be terrifying. In any case, let's just talk about the books that Mira Grant has written. I'm going to focus primarily on the ones that I have read, of course, and I will go a little bit more in depth on those ones, but I will mention all the other ones at the end so that you have a good idea of all the different things that she has written. But first off is the Newsflesh series, which I just mentioned, and it starts with Feed. Now, the premise of this, like I said, is that there is a zombie apocalypse. But essentially, there were two scientists. One who was working with a virus to mutate it to become a cure for the common cold, and then elsewhere in the country, there was another scientist who was mutating a different virus to try to come up with a cure for cancer. And due to circumstances, these two viruses met and mutated into a super virus called Callus Amberley, and it cured the common cold, and it cured cancer, and it also raised the dead. And so this book is actually a couple decades in the future. So the zombie apocalypse happened. We're back to just trying to we've already figured out our day-to-day lives, and we are now exploring a little bit of the new normal. Enter our main characters, George and Sean Mason. They are a sister and brother duo, as well as with their partner Buffy, and they are bloggers. And they have been asked to blog about the presidential campaign, basically follow one of the Republican candidates and just get that news out there. And this is kind of a big deal, so they don't want to mess it up. And it immediately, everything goes wrong because it's horror. So everything goes wrong almost immediately. But this is a series that is very well loved. So it is made up of the original trilogy and then a fourth book which follows a different cast of characters who are doing the live blogging for one of the Democratic candidates, and then a book of short stories. And essentially the original trilogy, every single one of those books was nominated for a Hugo. That's how well it is loved. So there's a couple things that you should know about this. First of all, if you are looking for a zombie apocalypse story with lots of gore and action and blood and violence, this is not going to be for you because the zombie apocalypse already happened. So yeah, there are the occasional zombie chases, but for the most part, society has learned to deal with it. And so it's not quite so like fight for your life. It's much more of a political thriller, murder mystery with the side order of zombies. The first book is an amazing standalone. So if you're a little bit wary of like jumping into another series, you can just read the first book and be okay. And just so you know, for the second and third book, I do think that they are good, but they do feel slightly different because it gets a little bit more science fiction. So the first book feels very it takes a lot of the same principles of our world, and it extrapolates like what would happen with this zombie apocalypse, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's still very recognizable. But the science that happens in book 2 and 3 is much less recognizable. It's much more science fiction. And so I did just want to mention that because that tonal shift can kind of catch people off guard. And then I will mention that it is a horror, and Mira Grant, aka Seanan McGuire, really doesn't pull punches. And so nobody is safe. No characters are safe. It could be an actual death, but it could also be things like loss of innocence or a situation that just breaks them. Like they are in a dire situation, none of their choices are good, so they make a choice and they hate themselves for it. So just a heads up, like with the short stories even, those are tearjerkers as well. I remember being on an airplane, reading the short stories, and I found myself sobbing on the airplane. I actually had to reassure the person sitting next to me that I was okay. It was like, no, this is just a really great book. And then I had to choose to read something else so that I didn't make everybody around me worried. But these are tearjerkers. But the best thing about these books is that it is very, very realistic. Seanan McGuire, Mira Grant, is very, very good at world building. And so it feels very real. In addition to the science, just how society would react is just very realistic. So, highly recommend this one. Especially if like you're interested in zombies, but maybe not like the whole blood, gore, violence thing. After that, we do have the Parasitology trilogy that starts with Parasite. And the premise of this trilogy is that, again, near future, and we have genetically altered tapeworms so that they are medically beneficial for humans. They give off medicine, they help control various diseases, so like heart disease, asthma, allergies, you name it, they help with it. And at the begin, this is an apocalypse book. So we start at the beginning when everything starts going horribly wrong, because horror, right? This is, again, really, really realistic. Seanan McGuire, Mira Grant, just really nails how people would react to this. And this is much more of the action-oriented, blood and violence kind of thing, because this is when the apocalypse happens, and the characters are trying to figure out what's going on and keep themselves alive and not make the situation any worse. So this is a trilogy, and I really enjoyed it. After that, we do have Into the Rolling, no. Oh my goodness. Rolling in the Deep and Into the Drowning Deep. I am so sorry. I always mess those names up because they're so close. But Rolling in the Deep is a novella, and then we have Into the Drowning Deep, which is its sequel and is a full-length novel. And this is about killer mermaids. So in the first book, or in the first, book, in the novella, essentially there is a TV network who makes documentaries, like conspiracy documentaries. I think you know what I'm talking about with that. But they send a crew off to the Mariana Trench and basically with a bunch of scientists and say, hey, find mermaids. And then, of course, what a lot of the scientists don't know is that this TV network also hired a troupe of professional mermaids just in case they don't find actual mermaids. But it turns out mermaids do exist, and they are not friendly. So that is the premise of the novella. And then, of course, it goes horribly wrong. And so in this book, they actually sent out another scientific mission, but like much better equipment, a lot more scientists to try to figure out what went wrong. This is much more of your monster horror kind of thing where you get into a situation and a monster is killing people and you just need to either kill the monster or get away, and that's how you win. And so that's much more what this is. It is very atmospheric writing, and so it makes you feel like you're there, like a monster might really be chasing you. You need to run for your life. I Again, this is a very realistic kind of setting. How people react is very, very realistic. The diversity in this book is where it's this book where diversity really starts to shine. We have two scientists who are deaf who communicate through sign language. We have an autistic character. We have the queer representation is off the hook. The only thing I can't speak to is race and ethnicity. And that's not because it's not there. It's because I don't remember. I don't actually picture characters at all. And so unless it has a bearing on the story, I don't actually know what race or ethnicity almost anybody is. If it comes up in the story, like, and they treated her differently because of the color of her skin, I'm like, okay, then I remember. But otherwise, not really. So it's not that it's not there. It's just that I don't know. Just wanted to make sure that that's pretty clear. And then lastly, the thing that I want to talk about this is if you do read Into the Drowning Deep, the ending is it divides people. So the thing is, and what I found is that you have to really believe in the science aspect of it, that a lot of this is plausible, and you have to be creeped out. And if you do, you're probably going to do better with the ending. But if you don't really believe in the science, or you're not really into the horror part of it, the ending's not going to work as much for you. So for me, the horror didn't work as much for reasons I'll get into in a moment. But I believed in the science, so I was just kind of meh at the ending. But again, if you don't believe the science, you're probably just not going to like the ending of this book. It is one of those things that is highly contested about this particular book. It's just the ending. And then we have In the Shadow of Spindrift House by Mira Grant. This is a short novel about Harlow Upton Jones, who is part of a teenage detective agency, and they're going to disband the detective agency pretty soon because everybody's aging out. And so Harlow is just like, hey, can we just do one more mystery? Let's go figure out what's going on with Spindrift House. And so that's what they do. This is very creepy. This is very atmospheric. And like for me personally, the ending was not a surprise because I do know Seanan McGuire's interests and hobbies and everything. Like I know enough to know what to expect, and so I wasn't really surprised. And this is the book where I realized I don't really get scared from horror because I don't really know why, but like this is very atmospheric, and I could tell it was supposed to be creepy, and I thought, I think this would probably be creepy for a lot of people, but it just wasn't for me. And I'm not really sure why that is, but I think it would work for most people. This is a much more traditional horror ghost kind of story. Not ghosts, but like a more traditional horror story, which is meant to scare you. And it is well done. Again, very atmospheric kind of writing. And then the last thing from Mira Grant that I have read is Kingdom of Needle and Bone, and this is actually a recent read, and this is one where if you have any anxiety about the current coronavirus pandemic, please don't read this. Like, it will set off everything you have because it is about a mutated measles pandemic, and it is really, really well written. Again, the science is just solid. That's what she is known for. It is just terrifying. This is also a book or a novella. It's 125 pages, and it really relies heavily on narration. So there is some action, there is some dialogue and all that kind of stuff, but it relies heavily on the story being narrated to you. So if that's not a style you like, then this is probably not going to be a novella that you like. But I personally, while I didn't love the narration style, I did think it worked for this particular novella. And in the end, I was scared. It made me anxious. So I think it did what it set out to do. Additionally, she does have another short story, getting into the books that I have not yet read. And she has another novella called Final Girls. She has a short story called Apocalypse Scenario number 683, The Box. That is actually a short story at 24 pages. She has a full-length novel set in the Alien universe called Alien Echo, and she has a short story in a book called Canto Bright, which is set in the Star Wars universe. I don't know a ton about any of these things, mostly because if you read the descriptions, it doesn't tell you a lot of things, because that's just generally how horror descriptions work, but I have heard mostly good things about them. So why is Mira Grant so awesome? If you couldn't tell, the science is there. It is so nice when authors actually get the science correct. And again, it's not necessarily probable, but it is plausible. So you can see how we can get from here to the horror situations that Mira Grant is talking about. And that is its own kind of horror. Additionally, she is really, really good at understanding how society will react to certain things, how individuals will react to certain things. So when you're reading these books, you know somebody who's going to have that kind of reaction. If we're talking about, for example, Feed, you know somebody who's a George, you know somebody who's a Sean, you know somebody who's a Buffy. Like, it's so realistic that it again, it becomes a little bit horrifying. It makes it just, because it's so realistic, you can just see how we could get from where we are now to this absolute horror situation that they are dealing with in the books. And that just makes it so terrifying, right? It's what I don't know if there's an actual term for it, but it's not really the terror of like reading the book and being scared at the moment. It's the kind of terror that comes in the middle of the night when you're trying to sleep and realizing that like legitimately this could happen, and should I maybe have like a plan worked out for what happens if there's killer mermaids, like. And so it's its own kind of horror. Now some of them are very atmospheric, like Into the Drowning Deep, as well as In the Shadow of Spindrift House. Those are very atmospherically written, and so they will scare you at the time that you're reading it, but again, it'll also scare you later. And I think that when we're talking about horror, that can only be said to be a good thing. It did its job. And like the last thing that I really think is a very, very big thing about Mira Grant is that she does characters really well. She makes them individual to the point where like her three main series, Newsflesh, Parasitology, and the Drowning Deep Mermaid, the Killer Mermaid series, they actually all have a character which is an older woman who is kind of a mad scientist type character. And they are so distinct from each other. There's three different characters that fall into this type, and they are so distinct from each other. I didn't even really realize that all three of these books had that character in it. And so it feels very realistic. There's nobody that's a super cardboard cutout, and it just makes it so nice. So if fully fleshed out, very realistic, very scary worlds is your thing, I highly recommend checking out Mira Grant. So that's all I have. Please let me know. Have you read Mira Grant? Is biomedical horror a thing? Like, that's something I'm actually curious about. But have you read Mira Grant? Are you interested in Mira Grant? Let me know down below. But until next time, guys, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.